value added courses is Center for Air and Space Law earlier. Now we upgraded to Center for Aerospace and Defense Laws. We have a very innovative courses. One innovative and important course today we are going to talk about is defense and security aspects. And this course is a combination of technology, law, and management. That's the reason why we call it a unique courses. So those who are interested, actually, they can look and they can get back to us. Then we will give clarifications about the course. So I just like to take this opportunity again to introduce my own good friend and my elder colleague, uh, Group Captain Naidu Garu. Naidu Garu is right now adjunct faculty, Center for Aerospace and Defense Laws. Earlier, he was, of course, right now he is also Director ISAC Cyber Security Clean Exit, and also he has a 30 years of experience as a aviator and also is a policy and management. He also earlier worked with the Doordarshan in many positions, like including the director, HR, operations, security, and so on. So he has a 30 years of experience in the operation, management, policy related things. So he has his own law firm actually, that is Akash Law Firm, which helps many people pro bono about various aspects of aviation related legal issues also. So without wasting much time, now I hand over mic to the Group Captain Naidu. He is going to moderate today's session. So I request Naidu Garu to begin the class.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. At the very outset, warm welcome once again to all the participants. Yes, there was a message that the background was not clear. It was because the power failure was there. And now you can see Professor Reddy also very clearly. And thank you very much, all the participants. Very, very excellent response to this event. This mapping the defense and security challenges of India, a way forward. This is second, as mentioned by Professor Reddy, second of the lecture series we have started. Last week we had one. Great response that shows how important the topic is and what a timing in terms of the problems that we are facing externally, internally. This topic assumes a great significance. We must thank the Nalsar University for conceiving this lecture series. Thank you once again, sir. And coming to the topic, mapping the defense and security challenges of India. Security, the very word is vast. Everyone looks at that word and it means different things to different people. During the prime ministership of Mr. Nehru, one of the journalists asked him, what are these threat perceptions for India? He said, there is no threat for India. We are a peace-loving country. We have friendly neighbors. There is no threat at all. And we had, within a few months, what is history now as 62 debacle. And peace came at a very, very expensive price. That's how it was. And if we go back to the history also, history is replete with invaders, marauders, looters, absolutely looting India from time to time. Various times it has been seen. Let's talk of Prithviraj Chauhan. He has not concluded the battle. Had he concluded, Ghori would have been a very small part of the history. We go to Panipat. Public went to watch the battle. They did not participate in the battle. That was again not given conclusion. When we look at the recent past also, we have had many people coming and taking away our wealth, our riches, our culture has been corrupted. So many things have happened. We are all privy to that. Now, when we talk about the security and security strategy, the challenges, what we will be discussing, and we have very great panel today to discuss those things. Security traditionally meant military, the political security, the social security, the economic security. These were the traditional concepts. But the concept has undergone a change over a period of time. Environmental security has added, the biological security, energy security, and the oil, maritime security, space, health security. We are in the midst of a pandemic and we are all suffering and we know what it means. The human security concept has come subsequently. And of course, the technology, the communication security, one of the topics is from a specialist who has, specialized in the technology in national security. So we will be talking some of these issues. Of course, the cyber security is one more aspect which has picked up momentum in the recent past and is causing a lot of consternation, a lot of difficulty in day-to-day functioning. These are the aspects that have been added subsequently to the traditional concept of security. Now, when we talk of security, we need to have a strategy. India, does it have a security strategy? Unfortunately, no. Very unfortunate. But we do not have a security strategy. It's in the making. So now, to quote Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, he said, India must stand up to the world because I believe that unless India stands up to the world, no one will respect us. Only strength respects strength. Strong words coming from a great person. Be strong to be respected. That's what it says. Now, when we look, we did mention about the public participation when I was talking about Panipat, Battle of Panipat. Now, the time has come where public participation has to be visible, has to be evident in all spheres of defense and security. Fortunately, the present government has made many changes, reformative changes in the recent past, which are allowing greater public participation, greater public-private participation in different modes. The modes are different, but yes, larger participation from private corporates is now possible. As mentioned earlier, today, while security, the topic is very vast, the topic is broad, we are going to limit our discussions to three specific areas. One is on the public-private partnership, what it means to all of us. The first speaker will be speaking about it. That will be Professor Arvind Kumar. Thereafter, it will be human security. Dr. Ramesh Kumar will be discussing those aspects which related to the national security. And third, at the last, is on the cyber security, how national security is being impacted by the cyber security, what you and I can do, what everyone and anyone can do to make sure that we contribute towards a safe and secure India from the cyber perspective. These are the three speakers. Now I take the privilege of introducing the first speaker, Professor Arvind Kumar. Professor Arvind Kumar, sir, he is head of the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations at Manipal Academy of Higher Education, Manipal. Very, very, great specialist. He is specialized in the areas of strategy, technologies in national security, foreign policy, and global security. He was earlier research faculty at National Institute for Advanced Studies, Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, our own IDSA. He taught at Delhi University. He was visiting faculty at Stanford University. He was also part of the Monitoring Center for Sandia National Laboratory, USA, visiting faculty at the Henry Stimson Center, Washington, D.C., and University of New South Wales, Sydney. He was fellow at Institute for Defense and Strategic Studies, Nanyang Technology University, Singapore. He has a number of publications to his credit and has the experience of lecturing extensively on security, defense, strategy, technology matters. Today, he will be speaking to us on challenges to India's national security and whether the private sector can help India augment its defense preparedness. What are the expectations from the private sector when they come forward to do the part, to play their part? Future of the PPP is one aspect that he will be discussing. And of course, what it means to all of us. All of us, when I say the legal professionals, the engineers, the entrepreneurs who are part of this presentation, today's lecture. With that, I now request Professor Arvind Kumar to kindly start his session. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much for a very kind introduction. And thank you, Professor Balakishna Reddy, for asking me to speak on a very important theme to such a very good gathering of scholars. I am really delighted. What I will do in the next 15 minutes is to give an overview about India's defense concerns, India's defense preparedness, role of private sector, and also what can really happen in the foreseeable future, especially when there will be an intensification of the role of private sector. I will also bring the element of defense startups. I will try to combine all these in 15 minutes. I think the most important case study to understand India's defense concerns right now is India-China standoff. What does it demonstrate to India? I think it has demonstrated a number of things. Undisputably, I think China has demonstrated its power trajectory. China has also reflected its intentions in showing to the world about its expanding behavior, expansionist attitude, and this particular experiment which China conducted, that is Galum experiment, I call it, that really has gone beyond the expectation of India. And if you see this whole Galwan experiment and the challenges which really are associated in terms of swaying whether India was prepared to handle this type of challenge coming from China. And one of the aspects which again becomes very important to really see is how India has been changing its perception about China. How India has been working towards seeing that how China really gets back to a status quo. There has been certain declaration about the partial withdrawal, but that is not a status quo. It again, what they have done is that they are pulling out from a point which they have declared as a buffer zone. And that again is in China's advantageous position. India's defense concerns have grown over the years. It's not that it really is limited. It is so dynamic that over the years, India's defense concerns have grown. India has been confronting multiple challenges from every domain, whether it is land, whether it is sea or air, and also from the areas of global commons, whether it was from outer space or it is from cyber or it is from maritime domain. I think India has really been facing complex threats and challenges. And these are all, in fact, increasing beyond proportion. It's not limited. And as I said, it will remain dynamic. Moreover, the new and emerging strategic environment will be affected by the technological developments. And these technological developments, again, is posing a lot of challenges, especially in terms of showing India's defense concerns and also India's defense preparedness. Technological developments technically add entirely new dimensions of challenges, such as the revolution in military affairs and also the overall debates which happens in terms of having a combination of both offensive and defensive capabilities. And one of the important things which the world has witnessed, especially in the last 2.5 decades in particular, is the information communication revolution, that is ICT revolution, information communication technology revolution. And that perhaps again has posed a lot of challenges to the aspect of information warfare. The major powers in particular have been competing for achieving information assurance and information dominance. And these two, again, in the information, intelligence information spectrum, obviously provides an edge to a country in terms of addressing to their defense concerns. More and more information, having to, in fact, getting to know more and more about its adversary, it's better for a country to evolve a good strategy. And that is how the things really are completely unfolding in that direction. The security environment keeps changing rapidly. Defense concerns do not get limited to India's borders. That is very sure, because there are a lot of internal security threat perception, which again have found a well-established linkages with external dimension. And that perhaps again is very important aspect to understand about larger India's defense concerns. India has to address substantive inter-services, doctrinal issues, the planning issues, which was told in the introductory remarks, the policy, the operational issues adequately. And somehow these aspects again require a very holistic understanding of India's growing defense concerns and defense challenges. Does India, this question keeps coming all the time in all the debates, scholarly debate, does India have a synergy among the defense services, even after creating Chief of Defense Staff position? And again, the assessment which really comes, especially in terms of building the jointness, again remains a far distant dream, especially in the context of understanding each of the services' positions on pertinent important themes impacting India's defense and defense concerns. The present system governing defense acquisition suffers from a lack of integrated planning, and that perhaps again is seen a lot of weaknesses in linkages between plans and budgets. And again, it remains a cumbersome task for India to really integrate its administrative, technical, and financial evaluation procedure to really come up with certain good strategy. So when one says that India doesn't have a national security policy, India does not have an integrated defense policy, these really require a much larger, broader exercise in terms of bringing certain aspects, which again would be multidimensional. It can't really be seen in isolation. India is yet to formulate its defense objectives. Technically, in fact, if you really get back and try to understand what is it that is supposedly India's objectives to be in the defense sphere, it is somehow very difficult to infer. And again, how best India can articulate its defense policy, which could be in consonance with India's national security objectives. I think these aspects, so I really compliment Professor Balakrishna Reddy to really have thought of this type of theme and also have started a course in this area, which combines technology, strategy, and the various aspects of international legal principles, because that perhaps is very important to really reach to a very holistic understanding of these many areas. In defense equipment development, there is a visible dysfunction between technological planning and development. And also one can see, which is very much visible, a dysfunction between research and development, production agencies, and the users. And this is, I can give you a number of examples to prove that why I say that there is a dysfunction between research and development, production agencies, and users. There is a lack of synergy between public and private sectors. And this push which really one sees in the recent times, that there is going to be a dominant role of private sector, let me tell you, this debate is not a new one. In the last 3 decades or so, this debate really got generated, especially in the early part of 90s, could not really lead to any fruitful exercise. And somehow this debate keeps coming in the larger manner in the current context, how best they can really enhance the role of private sector in the defense arena or in the strategic arena. There is a renewed debate, and again, the role of private sector again is going to be dominant. This is what is the expectation. And as I said, that this whole question of why there was no intensification of the role of private sector in defense was only because of the lack of trust and the trust deficit, which really led to this particular understanding that private sector cannot be trusted. And that is how the private sector was always kept away from the radar of the key policy issues of India. But at the same time, I would like to again emphasize here that the private industry in particular have already been contributing in not a very significant manner, but obviously in the context under which wherever there is a requirement from the strategic institutions like Department of Atomic Energy, Indian Space Research Organization, or Defense Research and Development Organization, private sector has been playing a very limited role, but at the same time, their role again cannot be undermined. I would like to give you an example. And one of the examples is a very significant one. When India was denied by the Soviet Union, the formerly Soviet Union and the now Russia, the cryogenic engine, India took a vow that India really has to build this cryogenic engine and started the whole project from scratch. And let me tell you, if you see the overall contribution of private sector in the overall design, production, and obviously the final operational engine, you will find that Godrej in particular contributed significantly. And for that cryogenic engine, again, a lot of the other private institutions again really came forward in terms of helping India in developing the various components and also helping India in terms of integrating those components in the full cryo engine area. And then other example, again, if you see in the satellite area, there are 38% of this satellite production, which again is envisaged to really move ahead to the private sector, and that how that will happen, I think the discussion already has started. I will give you another example how the role of private sector again was really in a functioning mode, and this is again light combat aircraft. Light combat aircraft, Tejas, it really has seen a lot of contributions from the private sector, a large number of vendors, subcontractors, which again really became very dominant in terms of helping India in building light combat aircraft. Take, for example, unmanned air vehicle. And if you see the origin of unmanned air vehicle and the way the things really got unfolded, especially in the DRDO, in fact, lab, in Bangalore and see the contributions made by the various other, in fact, in building the airframe, like one particular private industry is named Taniza, and they built the airframe for unmanned air vehicle and way back in the early part of 90s. And that again is seen to be some sort of a very important contribution of the private sector. But at the same time, these were not really been expanding in the way the things would have got expanded in the last 2.5 decades. And things really were very static, especially in the context of their contribution. So again, there was a need-based role for private sector. There's no denying the fact that Department of Atomic Energy always took the help from Larsen and Toubro in a various manner, especially in also, because as you know, India always functioned under sanctions regime. After 1974, the sanctions regime impacted negatively, especially in the context of the growth of a strategic industry. The strategic institutions existed, they had to struggle, they coped up very well, because ultimately the sanctions proved to be a boon in disguise, because India became self-reliant. India did pay the price in terms of time and money, but India certainly was some sort of a country which showed its resilience in terms of moving ahead, especially in producing and building certain very important strategic areas for defense. When you take, for example, ballistic missile and see the contributions made by India, no country has helped India in building ballistic missile, and no country will ever help India. But at the same time, if you see the public-private partnership, I think that got also reflected. The design was done in one of the laboratory in Hyderabad, but ultimately the whole integration happened at Bharat Dynamics Limited, BDL. Again, a lot of these things, if you try to really get back and see that how the defense public sector units, which were kept open, especially in terms of seeing that how those element of capability which existed in these many DPSUs, how those can really be harnessed by working together in many areas. So a lot of these things have happened, but the way India has to really look into, especially in the context of its expanding requirement in managing India's defense, especially in having a very robust land-based assets, a very robust air-based assets, and a very robust sea-based assets. And as you know that India has to transition. If India has to become a respectable player, I am very delighted that Dr. Naidu really highlighted about a strength, respect, and strength. I think that is a very, very important statement. And that has to only be corroborated when India transitions from being a net importer of defense equipments to a net exporter of defense equipments. How India will transition from becoming a net exporter of defense equipment again remains a part of challenge, and how India has to harness the potential of existing capabilities of private sectors. Military capability cannot exist in isolation. So no defense capability can really be achieved unless there can be unless there has to be a very robust public-private partnership. India has to learn from the United States experience. The US success story lies in the private sector. Any strategic area you just take as a case in point, you will find that it was private sector which really dealt with all the aspects of development, including the investment and the overall research and every aspect of these debates. So I think the Indian private sector, they certainly have made certain progress during the last few decades in the technological field. And one example which again we have not been able to harness or given importance much from the governmental point of view is India's IT industry. India's IT industry has been harnessed by the rest of the world more than India. And somehow India should have really done far better in its communication system, improvement in its various bandwidth problem which we are facing day to day in all our internet systems. A lot of these things could have happened. But somehow IT revolution again could not really brought sufficient dividend to India. By the way, let me tell you, the government never planned IT revolution. It was spontaneous. And that perhaps again was one of the reasons for its success, because the government of India never planned that there is going to be something called IT revolution in the later part of 90s. All of the things which happened was spontaneous, and this spontaneity really brought India on the world radar screen. The respect which India really garnered from the advances which India has made in the software development is phenomenal. That part I can tell you. Many of you may have, in fact, seen the progress which India has made in this area. But for India's own domestic consumption, for India's own larger role which it could have played in various ways in harnessing the potential of India's IT industry, that is yet to be realized. This is my perception. At the same time, to harness these potentials, I think these things we were undergoing. 20 years ago, let me tell you, 20 years ago, 6 task forces were constituted by the then Defense Minister, George Fernandez. This was set up basically to find how best defense industry nexus can be built. Defense industry nexus can be built. And to an extent, the whole proposals which were made by all these 6 task forces, 20 years have passed. Unfortunately, many of these recommendations which those task forces have made, I don't have the time to go into the details of these task forces recommendation, but unfortunately, those recommendations which were of greater significance to India's defense could not really get realized because the focus which India needed to put was not put sufficiently. Private sector involvement is essential. They don't deny the fact. If India is to modernize its armed forces and meet the challenges posed by the US-led revolution in military affairs, there is no point in really keeping private sector out. But has India done any assessment so far on the overall capabilities of private sectors? And some of these companies which I told you, whether it is Taneja or Godrej or various other Larsen & Toubro, they have been from time to time contributing in a limited way. But at the same time, if you take the other, the defense public sector unit, like Garden Bridge Shipbuilders, Engineers Kolkata, a lot of these things, if you take an example, especially which are involving themselves in building warship, I think there is no denying the fact because these public defense sector units obviously have to work under the sanctions regime in the past. The timeline which really was put, even I'll give you an example. If someone has really done some study on the INS Brahmaputra, happened to be a warship, and that took almost 12 years. This whole Garden Bridge Shipbuilders took 12 years. And that is almost, in fact, is done by the rest of the world in 4 years' time. So again, timeline becomes very important in terms of understanding these many issues which are of very complex nature in the areas of this defense. Defense preparedness obviously is completely centering around how India really understands its predicament in achieving certain capabilities which could really provide confidence and guarantee of its national security. It's not that India has to get influenced by the development which China has been undergoing. I think that really will not help. The action-reaction cycle, India has to understand in a very limited manner. India's reach will be different than the way China has been expanding. So again, the whole problem of understanding India's defense has to really bring the element of what India really articulates as a part of its requirement, what India really sees as a part of the essential requirement for its defense. And not only these capabilities are required for just keeping it, but also how best you can signal it. And that really has been exposed by recent India-China standoff, because India's defense preparedness, I'm not saying China was prepared. Neither India nor China was prepared for any type of up the ante. Obviously, that is what is not needed. India obviously has to go and see that how in any crisis, how that de-escalation starts as soon as possible. India did its best in terms of bringing China on the table, but at the same time, the capabilities do matter. If India signals those capabilities across Indian borders, I don't think that, in fact, China will ever think of Galwan. So Galwan really has opened the eyes of India, and will not be surprised, let me tell you, will not be surprised if tomorrow China really exceeds the whole of Galwan in their favor. The way things are coming up is certainly not a positive sign for India's defense. It certainly requires to put more and more emphasis on high technology, and obviously see that how those things can really help India in signaling this China. One of the important aspects, which again is required mostly in managing Indian borders, is having adequate technology in the field of intelligence information gathering mechanism, sufficient technology in maintaining surveillance across borders, and also reconnaissance. Let me tell you one important thing which has happened, especially in the last few months, that is the establishment of Defense Space Research Agency, which again has been declared as an agency which would really use satellites for military application. So that is perhaps is one development, but is that development only be done in the context of managing the larger defense, or how best India can boost its defense when it can enjoy the freedom to attack and freedom from attack? I think the freedom to attack and freedom from attack, if India gets that capability, that perhaps would really provide its larger confidence to really emerge as a respectable player in the whole of world. Self-reliance, whatever we are talking about, Atmanirbhar Bharat, I think this is focusing mostly on indigenization, but we are so weak in terms of our manufacturing capability. How best will move towards Atmanirbhar Bharat again remains a mystery to many of us who have been following these debates. Atmanirbhar Bharat requires a very broad-based infrastructure, which could really guarantee the overall intensification of manufacturing capabilities. And that again, India is far behind if it is comparing itself with China. So I think defense obviously can't be fully privatized. Defense again is seen to be a larger aspect of the debate, which again is centering around only the governmental circles. But things again might change in the foreseeable future, which could again provide certain ability to India in terms of really working very closely with the private institutions. The last point which I want to make is on defense startups. Defense startups really has shown that India really can improve its capability in many areas and become self-reliant. I think a lot of defense startups, examples I can give you, which really has brought DRDO and ISRO to their doors, and they have accepted their product, especially in the context of using them in the larger projects which these two institutions have in their different laboratories. So I think defense startups again is a good beginning, but how much really support one can really give from the governmental side again would depend upon the larger policy which India might like to evolve in terms of really seeing that how the sustenance of defense startups in the various sectors of defense again helps India in becoming more and more Atmanirbhar, that is self-reliant India. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for that overall perspective on security and the current situation. Also, you linked it up nicely. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
And coming to the next topic, I introduce Dr. Ramesh Kumar. He is the founder head, Center for Human Security Studies. He has also been an assistant professor with Advanced Center for American Studies, a research scholar, a PhD from JNU, postdoctoral from Israel. He has taught strategic studies while being at Delhi. His think tank is doing a lot of good work in security, human security, the cyber security. There are various papers that they have produced in the recent past which are of national interest. I now request Dr. Ramesh Kumar to please start his session. Dr. Ramesh Kumar.
Thank you, Naidu Garu. Thank you, Dr. Arvind Kumar sir, Professor Balkishan Reddy sir, and other friends and whoever is listening to this, and Rashekar sir also, another panelist. Thank you, Dr. Arvind Kumar sir. And important points. I would like to say 2-3 important points. I pick up from where my senior from JNU, Dr. Arvind Kumar sir, has left. Freedom from attack and freedom to attack. From there, I'll pick it up and put it in my human security perspective. Freedom from want and freedom from fear. That's what the human security concept is all about. You know,
Ramesh,
from the national
Ramesh, don't make it as a JNU debate. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. So freedom from attack and freedom to attack. That can be summed up as a national security, scenario in national security parlance. Let me confess to all of you. Human security is all about freedom from want and freedom from fear. So the citizens or the human being should have the freedom from want and freedom from fear. It's all about psychological. Security is mostly 99% is about psychology than having guns and arms and ammunitions or men and material. It's more of a psychological aspect that we are secured, we feel empowered. That's the thing. Okay, keeping that aside, human security concept. Me, Dr. Ramesh Kanniganti, the founder and executive director of Center for Human Security Studies, would like to put 2-3 things on table, for all of us to think, debate, and discuss. Number one, how can we make a self-reliant, self-dependent, proclaimed or self-empowered India without empowering the human security cause? In other words, let me put it in a simple words. Without having the food security, water security, environmental security, education related issues, empowerment of girls, women, we cannot achieve the comprehensive national security. So there should be a balance in the defense budgets between the national security priorities of the traditional sense, procuring, acquiring arms and ammunition, spending on Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, paramilitary, and also the balance must be on allocating money or funds adequately to public health, education, women-related issues, food security, environmental security, climate change. These also have become as important as national security priorities in the traditional sense. So this is one particular observation I would like to make. Number two, my talk is entirely on. I have actually studied and lived in Israel. I also studied and I also taught in United States of America. My doctorate was on United States-Israel strategic relationship. So I am going to keep right now the present topic, mapping India's defense and security challenges and the role of private sector and private participation in our defense and national security challenges. When I have put Israel into the perspective and frame and have seen, when I juxtapose the comparing and contrasting between the way that Israel has grown, the way India has grown or has been growing ever since. See, we had the same masters, British masters. I mean, 1947 we got independence, 1948 they got independence in the month of May. So they are actually 1 year younger to us in that sense. Israel is surrounded by whom? And India is surrounded by whom? If you see the geopolitical, geostrategic, context, I hope my senior Dr. Arvind Kumar sir would appreciate. If you see the ground realities, the geopolitical, geostrategic calculations and the realities, and who are our friends and neighbors, and who are the Israelis' friends and neighbors, and look at and then compare. If you go by that, I perfectly and I sincerely appeal to all the listeners, whoever is listening to me, Israel is the best model to emulate, to actually take as an example, not only Israeli defense model, but also the way Israeli Jewish lobby, American Jewish lobby, in other words, the way that they have been actually promoting Israeli interest through American Jewish lobby the world over. So two parallels I am drawing here. One, the Indian American lobby in the US Congress, number one, and the Indian defense model taking Israel as a role model, be it the private participation or the public participation. These are the two important parallels I wanted to draw, and I also want my listeners to think in these lines. Why Israel is a successful model? What are the bottlenecks or what are the challenges before Indian system? I don't need to really delve into, because all my audience, almost all of my audience are learned and informed audience. I am leaving it to your discretion only. But only 2-3 points what I have observed in Israel would like to put it here and do some kind of self-introspection and go accordingly. When Group Captain Naidu sir was giving the brief intro, he talked about national security strategy. I'm sure Professor Balakishna Reddy sir, who is listening, and Arvind Kumar sir and my other panelists also would agree with me. Till today, after 70 plus years of independent India, we do not have a written national security strategy. You tell me now, where are we? This is an important glaring mistake, I'm sorry to tell you. If we do not have some strategy written, that is what strategy? Not some strategy, national security strategy. then how can we leverage our socio-economic, political, technological, intellectual, ethical, moral forces to achieve a greater target called national security, strategic objectives? So the need of the hour is also not only having the defense production companies, not only having the private participation in the defense sector, but also in written national security strategy, and also a clear-cut 100-year formulation for a country. Look at China. Arvind Kumar sir also mentioned. I'm glad he actually opened up his presentation with China only. Well done. With 3,488 kilometers, to be precise, we are sharing our land border with whom? China, line of actual control. 15,000 kilometers of land borders India has to safeguard each and every day. 7,516 kilometers of coastal borders we have to safeguard. Total put together 22,000 kilometers India has to safeguard day in and day out. These are the hard fact realities, right? Given the LAC structure, given the LAC, topography, the weather conditions and all that, to what extent have we procured arms and ammunition from Israel? That is point number one. Point number two, if you see the last 70 years, I will divide into three parts: India's defense procurement, as well as stabilization, as well as producer. India as a procurer, defense; India as a stabilizer, in that sense, defense production; and India as also provider. This is what exactly, when I compared with Israel, if I take Israel 70 years, this is what they have divided. That kind of strategic thinking is needed to what to procure, when to procure. Once we procured, how do we add indigenous technology, what we have procured already from other country, be it Israel, be it France, be it United States, be it any country, and what do you produce out of that procurement after a certain point of period, to produce and to market worldwide, to also self-reliant. What kind of strategies are in place? What kind of ecosystem is in place? So these are all the fundamental questions. Once we have answers to this, then how much of GDP? Look at the Israeli GDP and defense share in it. Look at the Indian GDP and the defense share in it. They're more than 4% of their GDP. What is the population? 70 lakhs to 80 lakhs, 8 million. What is India's population? 130 plus crores. Out of our GDP, how much of percent is going to defense or military? In other words, around 2%. How much of that is going to R&D, research and development? Negligible. So these are some of the important questions that we as an academic and think tankers should insist, maybe lobby with the government of India through an institution of eminence like NALSA, or a geopolitics, a private setup, but doing very well, Manipal geopolitics. This is very important. I'm taking names out because you guys are doing an extraordinary job of giving that niche edge into the strategic thinking and the defense and security preparedness. So this is the need of the hour. More and more universities, more and more organizations of this sort should actually focus, should make youngsters to think, should get them into this kind of strategic thinking. Sometime back I mentioned to all of you about the 22,000 kilometers of borders we have to share, both coastal and land. What about the cyberspace? What about the cyberspace? What are we doing? I'm sure my friend Arvind Kumar sir, senior sir, would you like to appreciate this? The geopolitics of artificial intelligence, is it in favor of India, sir? No. Emerging technologies like IoT, artificial intelligence, blockchain, whatever you name it, we are nowhere nearer to Israel. We are nowhere nearer to China. We are nowhere nearer to United States of America. See, these are all the hard questions that we all have to, even though it is little inconvenient or little uncomfortable or discomfort to the ears, but these are the hard realities that are plaguing this country for the last 70 plus years. The geopolitics of artificial intelligence, especially cyber security area, because Professor Balkishan Reddy sir very specifically mentioned in the invite, cyber security realm. If you take the geopolitics of artificial intelligence, we are somewhere, out of 130 plus countries, out of 193, I'm only taking 130. Out of 130, India is somewhere down the line, maybe first 20 में, नीचे 10 से ऊपर है. What I'm trying to say is, 15, 16, 17, 18 में पड़ता है. I think, we have a long way in that sense also. And one more important point I would like to mention, because Balakrishna Reddy sir mentioned in the invite again, the role of private security agencies. The role of private security agencies in the overall defense and security, safeguarding mechanism, or what is the contribution of private security agencies for the overall national security and defense issues. If I put it this way, I happen to be the advisor to Andhra Telangana private security agencies for the last couple of years, along with Dr. Sri Swarnajit Sen, our Honorable ex-DGP of Andhra Pradesh. We have a number of issues that are really plaguing the Private Security PASARA Act, Private Securities Regulation Act, passed by Parliament of India in 2005. Till today, there is no unanimity of sorts. Different state governments are using different yardsticks for the private security agencies to flourish or to perish. All these issues are plaguing. Otherwise, enormous contribution is given by private security agencies in India in the overall national security. Why? I'll tell you. With the emergence of liberalization, and privatization, and we have already crossed Americanization, we are going towards Chinization. So in this context, given the 21st century realities again, given the geopolitical geostrategic realities again, private security has become such an important thing, because you cannot manage the public security all the time. The paramilitary forces, army, navy, air force, or police, or intelligence, when you do the population police ratio also, we are lagging behind. So we have to welcome private security agency in the overall national security management. Also, we should have a private army. Nothing wrong in thinking in those lines. Okay, whether you implement it, don't implement it, it's a different thing. But it is nothing wrong to simulate as an idea in the labs, in the laboratories of universities or think tanks, or maybe a department of geopolitics like Manipal. Nothing wrong in putting our minds and hearts into that kind of research. So all these things. Finally, what I would like to one more important point I would like to flag here, because I can answer it in the question answer session. See, when I have seen Israeli defense industry, there is this national sense of belonging, whether a rainy day or a shiny day. When it comes to the question of national security, they are all in one. Be it Likud party, be it Labour party, be it Shonai, be it any other party you name, when it comes to national security, one voice, one flag, one country, one constitution, like that. But when it comes to India, we are actually the fault lines. Chinese are right now, you think about what right now Chinese are doing. Chinese are using the fault lines in India, the northeastern conundrum, the sometimes the Maoist elements, the Red Corridor, everything they have been using to their purpose, including the countries who are outside of India, like Pakistan, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. They have a great strategy called 1949 to 2049. Where is India's strategy written for 100-year-old? We are also 5,000 years. They are also 5,000 years. If they have a strategy for 100 years, why not India has a strategy for 100 years? We should have 1949 to 2014. If their strategy is like that, they are going phase by phase. Now, 2013, Xi Jinping, when he took over as the president of the Chinese, Communist Party, and also the president of the China, he has a Belt and Road Initiative lying to annex, to encircle, to entrap, to enlarge the Chinese objectives to all over the country by laying the Belt and Road Initiative. What is India's answer to Belt and Road Initiative? We have on paper. To what extent is it really happening? Are we able to get others onto the board? Are we really doing that kind of mathematics, that kind of gymnasium, the mental gymnasium? I'm not talking about the physical gymnasium, the mental gymnasium, to get them on board, to counter Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And out of 700 universities in this country, how many universities have a course like defense and strategic security analysis? All these hard-hitting realities we have to actually take into account and look to Israel, look up to Israel, and get not only the manufacturing, the defense policies of Israel, but also one more important point, and I'll conclude because I can take it in the question answer session. The way that normal Israeli citizens are being made part of the national army. It's not about the 1.14 million, or it's not about the 35 lakh personnel, in different army, navy, air force, and paramilitary forces working in India. No, out of 130 crores, you need to. The time has come. The need of the hour is. Maybe I request both Arvind Kumar sir and Balakrishna Reddy sir to infuse this as a project work to make Indians also, to make normal citizens also with proper health to get into the armed forces, strategic thinking, not only in the classroom but also in the physical level also. So unless and until you do these kind of exercises, physical exercise, mental exercise, spiritual exercise, and technological exercise, more than anything else, you should have the clarity of thought and the clarity of mind to hit our neighbors. They don't deserve to be also called neighbors. One or two important countries called China and Pakistan, because every time they wanted to loot India, they wanted to hit India, they want to break India, they want to make India into pieces. If this is the national objective of those two countries, I think we should go beyond the talking issues, and also we have to walk the issues. With this, I conclude. Jai Hind. I'll answer your questions in the Q&A if you have any.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramesh Kumar. Thank you so much. The human security and all the elements of human security and how to make more number of people join the armed forces, deal with the neighbors. These are the issues that you have covered, and thank you very much for that. And that brings me to the next speaker and the last speaker for today on a very important topic that has also been raised by the other two speakers, most importantly by Dr. Ramesh Kumar. That's cyber security and the national security. Ladies and gentlemen, we have Mr. Rajshekhar Pullabatla. He has over 2 decades of experience in cybersecurity in corporate sector as well as in the government of India and many agencies that we have who use these cybersecurity systems, processes, tools, and of course the information. He is also a founder director of a non-profit organization known as Information Sharing and Analysis Center, which works in cybersecurity realm. He has created 2 incubations out of that is in cybersecurity. One is concentrating on the physical security labs and the virtual cybersecurity labs on cloud, and one is on the workplace ethics. The ISAC is a public-private partner with the NCIPC, which is the nodal agency under the law for cybersecurity in India. It's also an MOU partner with CERT-In, which is the second arm of the government of India responsible for the cybersecurity in India. These are the 2 agencies under IT laws as nodal agencies for the cybersecurity. In addition, he is involved in a lot of other things. Without wasting any more time, I request Rajshekhar to please speak on the cybersecurity and the relevance to the national security, how public-private partnership can move these things better. Thank you very much. Raj, over to you.
So thank you for the kind introduction, and I thank all the panelists today who are present here, and I'm really happy to hear the passionate speech by Mr. Ramesh. I really loved it, and again the insightful discussion by Mr. Arvind Kumar. It's just fascinating that how both the speakers are sharing thoughts which completely resonate with mine to most extent to what even I feel the same thing. So a couple of things. Sir, is it possible to share the screen and the presentation which I had given? Is it possible? I can just try to share. Just a moment. Actually, I would not have.
You can share the slides.
Yeah, but just because some bullet points will help in.
Yeah, it's a very technical subject. It is possible that some of the things will help if they are in the bullet points.
So I'll just move forward. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, it is visible.
Yeah, so now because we just have like 10 to 15 minutes to discuss, now the area is so vast, the subject is so vast that you literally cannot cover everything under this ambit. But these are 5 important topics which I personally believe where some action can take place practically in short-term time or in long-term time, which can do a big difference to what we are trying to achieve here. And to give a small background on the first point here, I completely agree with what Mr. Ramesh some time back said, and even what Mr. Arvind said about public-private partnerships. I strongly believe that the private sector has a phenomenal opportunity to offer intelligence to the government and work very closely with the defense in a public-private partnership mode. Now, the thing is that you should be aware that the largest contributors to bug bounty programs, or programs in which the hackers contribute in finding vulnerabilities about a certain product, the largest in the world are Indians globally. Okay, they find problems in various departments, websites, companies, and they submit it to whom? They submit it to US companies to get some dollars as prize reward, but it is completely not acknowledged in India. There is no system in place. Even if a system is in place, it's not good enough for people to get motivated to join such a program. It's a massive intelligence failure in my view, because you have the best of the Indians' brains contributing to the intelligence outside and giving it to the US for earning money, right, sitting at home from India, and the Indian government is not able to utilize the same intelligence for their own purpose. So I have closely worked with multiple agencies in India for cyber intelligence, and I know that the amount of hackers that are there in India are phenomenal. They can do amazing work, but there is no mechanism to protect them. There is no mechanism to retain them over time. There is no mechanism to institutionalize their work and their contribution over a period of time so that they can continue contributing to this. So what happens is that once a great project happens, the main person in the government department, they change, the whole team collapses, right? The new person will not entertain these people. He will not acknowledge the intelligence given, because for them it's like, I'm here for 2 years, let me make what I can, the best of this position, and go out. I really don't care about what my guy has done previously. I don't even want to give him credits for what he has done. And they will just, this is psychology here. Okay, so that's a big problem that we are facing. So one big point, if the government creates a mechanism to involve private companies in bringing cyber intelligence for example, building teams that can work only on getting intelligence on China, building private teams which can build intelligence only on Pakistan or any other country for that matter, the whole game will change phenomenally. Today it happens, but in a very small capacity. It is not systematic. It is not proper. So over time these things collapse. They run successfully for a few years, but they collapse. If you have a long-term plan, if you have a documented strategy, this will not happen, as pointed out by my previous speakers. So again, what's the advantage of this? To give you a small insight of how big this can be a game changer for us, a simple intelligence unit, when it works on foreign intelligence, it generates on an average 40 to 50 terabytes of data per month. Okay, this is like documents, videos, Excel sheets, email dumps from the enemies. You hack into them and you get this data. But one question to you: if you have, let's say, 20,000 emails to analyze as a department, can you do it manually? You cannot. If it's in Chinese language or some other language, can you read it and try to decipher what's there? You cannot. What will you need? You will need big data analytics. You will need artificial intelligence. You will need machine learning. You will need translators. You will need a whole lot of team and supporting industry to come forward and actually help you make sense of the intelligence. Again, if you don't work on the intelligence on time, it is like food. Food, if you leave it on the table for too long, you can't enjoy the taste of it. And after 2 days, you cannot even eat it. The same goes with intelligence. Once you get some information, you need to consume it in time. If you don't consume it, if you wait and keep it in the locker for like 2 months and then try to analyze it, it's absolutely waste of energy and time. So this is one area where I believe that we should do. Another important area is providing IT infrastructure for facilitating intelligence. The big problem with intelligence collection is this. Tomorrow, if we have to have private servers where the data can be stored, you think that you're going to store it on your laptops? Today, there are no mechanisms by the Indian government where even if operation takes on, they don't have the right technology infrastructure which can actually come and protect the hackers or protect the offensive teams in a very big way. So this is very, very, very lacking, and we hope that it improves. Okay. The second point. Now again, this has been discussed a lot, but then offensive security and malware research. Now, Mr. Ramesh pointed out that the research in India is next to zero, right? And there are many countries outside who promote research. They spend a lot of money, on research work. But in India, we spend a lot of money in buying technology, but then we don't, promote research as much as needed. Now, Israel, what Mr. Ramesh mentioned, yes, they are very good at what they do. So is US. That's because they promote research work in a very big way. So the point is that if India starts investing in malware research or hardware research or promoting teams which are actually embracing hardware hacking, they promote the culture of this in schools. From today, 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, you will see a significant advantage in the way startups are created in India, right? So you need to teach young people the joys of hacking. You need to teach young people the joys of reverse engineering and malware creation for research purposes, because this will help you to create products. It will help you to become offensive, but this is something which is required. Again, the bug bounty programs, they're in US, but in India, people have tried doing it, but then there is no big support. A simple example: if I find a bug in a government website, what is my incentive to report it to them? Why should I report it? I don't even get a certificate of appreciation if I do this in many places. Plus, if I send a mail to the department saying that I found a bug in your website or there is a potential leak in your database, the person who is heading the department will actually file a police case or a cybercrime case saying that you're trying to hack. Right? I have seen my friends who were arrested and tortured in jail, their hands broken because they reported a cybersecurity incident on the company proactively to help the company secure it. But then the case was filed on them, and then they were beaten in the jails for it. Right? It's nonsense in the way in which it's perceived. But anyways, this is something which is a very important area, and promoting offensive security matters is very crucial. If it can be done, it's great. Now we have two bodies, NCIPC and certain which are responsible for cybersecurity in India. Like NCIPC is responsible for CIR protection, and we have certain responsible for incident response largely. But the point here is that the burden on these organizations is so huge that they really need a lot more enhancement of powers and capacity to do what they're supposed to do. Because even if there is a great project, they just don't have the required funds or the required manpower to actually take it to reality, right? So we are very good in creating multiple agencies. So every year, you will have the government announcing one more agency, one more post, one more department, one more new services. What's the point? These people don't even talk to each other. These people, one department will do something and they will never share what unique thing they have done with some other department. And everybody, there's an upmanship, like, it's my turf. Why are you trying to make, try to work on this area? Don't work, it's my area. It's very funny. In China or Israel, this psychology is not there. As Ramesh pointed out, they work as one nation, one policy, one team. But in India, it definitely is lacking. So again, from a practical perspective, because these are nodal agencies created by the government, I think that there should be more done to enable them to do more. They can do more, but they really are stressed out. Most of the time they are politically struck out in answering flimsy questions in the parliament, because they're just too busy politically, right? We need to free them from these problems and make them work for what they have been actually created, right? Again, funding of startups. I'll give you a simple, interesting case study. I was in Dubai some months back for consulting the Dubai police for a project, and there was a delegation from Israel. I thought it's a private company trying to pitch a product, fantastic. But to my shock and amazement, he was an official government representative from Israel who brought in a delegation of startups from Israel at the government's expense to pitch the products of Israel in that country. Can you believe that? Can you tell me any Indian official, any embassy, or any government department doing this for Indian startups, taking them out for the country and selling those products to that government outside the country, saying that these are my people, my team, try to give them a chance. I am officially representing the government, give them an opportunity for a POC, and we will support you. Can you believe that? This is the kind of support that should be done in India, right? All the embassies which are there outside, what are they doing? If Israel can do this, why Americans can do it? Why can't Indian embassies do this? Why can't an embassy outside the country also double up as a sales office for Indian startups? This is something which I was so surprised at the model that, wow, I certainly wished for a small time that I wish I had a startup in Israel and I was supported like this way, that it would have been so fantastic. But anyways, the other point is POCs. The problem in India again that we have faced is that any startup which comes with a great idea, the first thing that the government guys who are involved in any decision-making process, they will say, why can't you do a free POC? Okay, free mein kuch kar do, kuch de do. It's highly irritating. You want to claw your face out when you hear these arguments. That for the country, please do it. The point is that startups struggle a lot to create technology and innovation, and then if you're not supporting them with the right kind of environment, how are you supposed to make them meet ends meet and continue giving good support, right? So this mentality of getting everything free is something which is very bothersome, and there has to be a policy, or there must be a policy which allows certain funding to be allocated so that the POCs from Indian startups can be included as part of the national process. They can be given some funding. It's okay if it fails, but some will shine, and that is what matters, right? So again, I'll give you one example. We recently won an award for a startup. Okay, we were competing among 100 startups, and we won an award recently. You know what is the funding amount that they promised? They gave 1 lakh rupees. What will happen in 1 lakh rupees? You know what is the salary of one security engineer who works in a startup? At least 2.5 lakh rupees. 1 month salary. Okay, good developers or good engineers who code programs. Okay, you have a startup of 5 guys, you are spending at least 15 to 20 lakh rupees per month. Forget the IT expenses, forget the office cost. And you have this grand schemes, coming from the government and other so-called industry bodies for a cash price of 1 lakh or rewards of 5 lakh rupees. How pathetic it is. What would you expect from that kind of money to be done? You will not be even able to pay salary for 1 month of 2 employees in that money, right? So I strongly believe that the funding psychology has to change drastically in India. If some good has to come out, it has to be something decent. What is this? इससे तो अच्छा कि पैसा लो ही मत आप, दो ही मत आप, right? So anyways, I'm not saying that it is a bad thing, but the point is it has to be reasonable. I mean, you are like saying, okay, there's a happy birthday party, don't give a gift, give 11 rupees in an envelope. I mean, it has come to that now for startups in India. Okay, but anyways, the point is that if there's something can be done to enhance the funding in a proper manner, it will be fantastic. Okay, and again, the way in which there's this market their companies and startups, it's just mind blowing. Okay, lastly, again, another important point. There are many problems in India when it comes to security, right? Like, you must be aware that there are more than 380 plus terrorist organizations operating within India, from the country they operate, right? Homeland security is a problem. You have border tensions, you have internal security issues. What are we supposed to do? Now, one point is this. Do you know that India is number 1 in cyber crimes across the whole world? Number 1, the amount of cybercrime complaints that come in India, they have surpassed every other country in this world. And when you go to a lawyer to file a complaint, to take help, most of the lawyers will say that if there's a criminal complaint, please come to me. There's a property dispute, please come to me. But cyber complaint, I don't know how to do something on Facebook. I have completely no idea of how Instagram works. Someone sent you a picture. I'm sorry, I don't know how to help you properly. Even the police will not be able to assist. What is needed? Capacity building and training. There's a tremendous opportunity for lawyers to learn cybersecurity and actually completely open a new vertical of business in consulting and cybercrime and assisting cybercrime victims. But are we doing enough in those lines? There is a strong need for integration of cybersecurity training, with the police and the lawyers. Okay, there is a strong need to teach cybersecurity to teachers and parents also. Why? Because it's a young generation of India which is getting trapped into these frauds, and they just are committing suicides because of bullying online. You need to protect these people also. So the lesser the complaints in the country because of awareness, the better will be the police equipped to handle bigger problems in life, right? The better the country will be, right? So even one person getting aware on cybersecurity issues is very good for the country. But anyways, outside, the policy is that if people try to do cybersecurity courses, the government funds it. Not fully, but maybe they'll fund 80% of it, 50% of it. It is something that we need to start doing it in India, right? If it's possible, because not everybody can afford very good cybersecurity courses. Though India is still the cheapest market for this business, but then still it's expensive, right? We have about 3,500 crores allocated for CPS simulation from the government. We have absolutely no clue what happened on that budget, how it is being spent. It's completely cryptic in the way in which the process is being done. Of course, there may be a better way. They are doing it a better way. We don't know that right now, but it could be faster, right? The capacity requirement in India is so high right now that we don't have people to hire. The companies are struggling for finding good people. My startup is struggling to find very good cybersecurity engineers, but I'm not getting anyone because all they do is that they have this stupid certifications which they pass online. In 15 minutes they pass the exam, and they are certified hackers after that, right? And they come for jobs. You ask them to run an Nmap tool, or you ask them to run some activity online for offensive security, or try to do a pen testing, they are not able to do anything. Okay, so capacity building is a big problem, and I think there is something that we as a country can do in these areas. So that's about it. Because of the short time that we have, I just touched upon these quick points. These are a few things that we as a country can do, and I definitely resonate very much with what both our panelists have said, because I also share the same passion and the same line of thought that this is what we need to do. So with this, my session is over.
Thank you very much, Raj, for that. And of course, we are running out of time. We have a lot of questions being asked by the participants, and yes, very, very insightful, rightly linking the cybersecurity to the national security, what need be done, how the private participation can be enhanced in this sphere. Thank you so much for that presentation of yours. Coming to the questions, all three panelists, I request individually the question to whom it is addressed. First question is how to deal with internal security more than the external security. This is asked by Shiv Charan. May I request Professor Arvind Kumar to kindly address this question, sir. His perception is the internal security is more demanding than the external security for us, and how to deal with it today.
Correct. I think it's a very good question here asked. And as I said in my lecture, that internal security threat perception, if one articulates, that has a strong linkage with external dimension. Whether it is to do with insurgency in the Northeast, or left-wing extremism, or for that matter, terrorism, anything you take up as a part of problem for India, we have very, very strong basis from external dimension. Many of these things are being handled. I think India has fairly done well in handling left-wing extremism. And as you know that even the state of Andhra Pradesh itself was having a lot of challenges in the past. Greyhound experiment really was so successful. It is being replicated in the rest part of the country. So I think a lot of things are happening. Terrorism becomes a great menace. And handling terrorism remains a part of challenge for India. Cross-border terrorism remains an element. How best India can manage surveillance across India-Pakistan border 24/7 again remains a part of challenge, because India certainly requires a lot of sophisticated sensor system. India does not have adequate sensor system to manage surveillance across Indian borders. Just you think, if India manages surveillance across Indian borders, many of the challenges emanating from infiltration would be automatically addressed. But somehow that thing is not happening. Other issues with regard to insurgency, a lot of challenges. Again, if you see a small arms proliferation, drug trafficking, these are all having linkages with terrorism. And perhaps I think India is yet to find a comprehensive strategy in handling those aspects of the challenge. Counter-terrorism strategy of India is working very well with the United States, because one of the essential elements which is needed for addressing the counter-terrorism issue is how best a country is sharing the intelligence information. India and the US, I am not saying that they are sharing all the information, but at the same time, I think they are sharing the certain information which again builds win-win situation for both the countries. And this is what is the success story of India's counter-terrorism strategy. Counterfeit currency proliferation, that remains a part of the challenge. Role of ISI is increasing. ISI has been building bases across India's neighborhood, whether it is Nepal. You can see Nepal being a tiny country, how much problem Nepal poses to India. At this time, Nepal has been able to bully India by having the new map. So I think a lot of these issues are very, very important, especially from India's national security point of view. And internal security will have a lot of these type of issues coming up. Much of these things, which again are supposed to be understood in a comprehensive manner, is homegrown terrorism. Homegrown terrorism again remains a very important challenge. And that finds again linkages with the ISI. So I think a lot of these things we have to understand in a comprehensive manner.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Before asking the next question to Professor Balkrishna Reddy, I want to tell the participants that this is the second of the series, and no need to worry about the attendance, because we have record of all the people because of the registration. And 4 lectures, if they attend, they will get certificate of attendance. Then 6 we have, so it's participation. We have other conditions also have we have notified already, and this recording will be available on the YouTube. That's for sure. Sir, the question now to Professor Balkrishna Reddy, as someone who is a specialist in international trade as well. Why are we still relying on China for many products to be imported even during this crisis period? Why is the trade balance not getting normalized? Why are we reliant still on China? This is the question, sir. Professor Reddy, could you please?
Yes. Of course, both India and China both are parties to WTO, and of course we have a bilateral. There are thousands of bilateral existing multiple products also. But one question pertaining to India and China is dumping, anti-dumping, dumping. Lot of things they used to dump with less margin than what they sold in their country. Actually, this was a practice going on for years. Of course, because now situation has changed, and the government of India has taken a lot of initiatives to stop trade, including investments and other dumping related. And recently you have seen we stopped a lot of these IT related websites also. So it is not one day affair. Actually, it has to continue. But now perception is changing, and we are going to rethink in different manner after post COVID thing. So that is the basically deals with the bilateral trade agreement with India and China.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. This is a question from S. Rao. Maybe I'll take the privilege of answering this question.
Yeah.
So the question is on press and media going overboard. They are being counterproductive. Are there any measures to control them? So yes, the Press Council of India Act. I take this liberty of answering this question, sir, please, because of being associated with that activity there. And India, we have the Press Council Act, but the Press Council Act talks encouraging silence that can be made by the Press Council of India, but there are no punishments that can be given. Ministry of I&B recently has banned 2 channels for some time, a couple of days ban they have given, but that again was because of the content which was not acceptable. When we talk of press regulation, it is a self-regulating authority that is there, that is National Broadcasting Standard Authority. and the complaint has to be made to the Press Council of India, and there is a process where the Press Council of India investigates and accordingly deals with the issue. Per se, we encourage freedom of press, and we do allow them to report what is on there. The self-regulating measures should come into place, and they should observe the ethics, the broadcasting ethics, the coverage, the press ethics. But yes, there are aberrations, and we do deal with them once in a while. This is what we do have: a self-regulating authority. There is a process. It's not definitely as strict as we want, because we encourage freedom of press. That's from S.N. Rao, that question. The next question is from Vishnu. How can the role, this question is to Dr. Ramesh Kumar. How can we enhance the role of private security agencies and private sector in national security? Repeat the question, Dr. Ramesh Kumar. Do I repeat?
Ramesh?
Dr. Ramesh Kumar, are you here? This question is, do I repeat the question? Enhance the role of, how do we enhance the role of private security agencies and private participation in national security?
Okay. Good. So as I told you some time back to all the participants, the PASARA Act, Private Security Agencies Regulation Act, has to be implemented properly, which is not being done. Different state governments have different yardsticks. That's why there is no unanimity in the salary part. There are no benefits, important benefits like health benefit and other important benefits that are to be given. They're also not properly maintained. And one more thing is, you have to bring that kind of self-esteem and prestige to the private security agencies' jobs. You have to bring that self-esteem into the private security guards. Private security guards should be accepted, and they also should feel that we are inferior to none, and we are also playing an important role. That is one. And one more thing is important thing is we have to make sure that private security agency guards or private security guards are getting proper salaries, because mostly what happens is in the middleman, or sometimes the hierarchy happens the typical Indian way. It is written on the paper 20,000 salary. By the time he gets, it is only about 9 to 10,000 some cases. So where are the remaining 10,000 going? Nobody knows. भगवान जानता है. So ये सारे चीजों में बहुत काम करना है, और देश में इसके बारे में भी एक डिबेट डिस्कशन होना है. और इम्पोर्टेंट चीज है, प्राइवेट सिक्योरिटी एजेंसीज एंड प्राइवेट सिक्योरिटी गार्ड्स, whether we accept or not, now it has become the norm of the day. You go to any private mall, shopping mall, bank, community, what do you call the real estate thing, community housing projects, you go anywhere and everywhere, they are there. So they are indirectly doing a lot of job, and they can be used as a human intelligence to the police department. They can be used as human intelligence to the paramilitary forces also. So these are all very important connects. See, if you cannot connect the dots, you don't get intelligence. That's what we have been taught in intelligence circles. Connecting the dots. So these are the important dots.
The next question is to Rajshekhar. Rajshekhar, are you there? Two parts I want to ask you. Are you hearing me? Okay. Two parts. One is Dr. Ramesh Kumar has just mentioned an issue about security guards not getting paid and those differences that is coming up, middlemen eating up money. That is one part. The other question is by Tripti. How is banning 59 apps, China-based apps, helping India? These are the two questions. Please answer these two questions.
So on the first part, about the security guards part, what is the exact context of the question that you've asked me? Can you repeat that, please?
Dr. Ramesh Kumar just now said that there is a problem of security guards not getting the salary that they have been promised and things like that. There are ethical issues.
Yeah, that I can answer. Okay. So the thing is that there is a specific training for security guards which has to be standardized, which is today absent. And second is that the most important point where the ethics issue of the companies who recruit these people also and manage these security guards. Though there are the PASAR Act and other acts are there, the companies also sometimes they take advantage of these people and they exploit them for very low salaries and make them work like this. So there is a process called ethics rating for these companies, which will enable the security guards to have a better say in what they do. And of course, it's a long discussion altogether on the ethics part of the companies and how it impacts them. But yes, there is a solution to that in many ways, wherein the behavior of the guards as well as the behavior of the companies hiring these guards can be actually controlled in a manner where they come at a level where they behave properly with respect to market dynamics and also respect the laws in proper manner. There is a mechanism to do that. So that's the first part. Elaboration is very difficult right now at this point, considering the time, but there is a solution on the ethics part of that. The second point on how banning the 59 Chinese apps helps. Please understand this. There are different kinds of wars that we can have, right? So one is one also is called is an economic war. So TikTok, for example, 30% of the total user base comes from India, and they have billions of dollars of revenue that they generate from the ads only from the Indian market. Now, one blow like banning the app in India has literally wiped out billions of dollars from the company's revenues. Right? If this continues for a longer time, this will impact the company's business for too long. And I can tell you that when you run a company and when you're not given the opportunity to have your user base with you, you literally lose and you bleed. Right? So that is one way of getting back. And the other point is this. It's not just about banning the apps, but let me ask you this. CCTV cameras in the whole of country, which companies are most popular? Chinese. My question to you is this. Will you allow, this was a question asked by one of my very good friends called Jiten Jain, but I'm just repeating it here. Will you allow Pakistani companies to, sell CCTV cameras and deploy the technologies in India? No, right? So why Chinese? You should see the same perspective. Technology is a very crucial thing. If you allow them to do all these things, it's a problem. The same goes with apps. Now, on your mobile phone, every damn thing that you have on your phone is actually taken away by Chinese companies. They monitor and they try to take intelligence out of that. It's a great intelligence to them. So by denying the apps in India, you're actually helping security in a very big way, because these apps are known, and it is a fact, technical fact, that they do siphon off user data for intelligence. So in a way, it's a good move, and I think other countries like Australia and US are also considering this ban now for Chinese apps. But let me tell you one more thing before I conclude this. The biggest spy in this world, or the biggest spies, are the Americans. Okay, you have to give it to them, right? So while you have your problems with China and Pakistan, you should remember this, that even Americans are no different technically, right? Because your allies, you cannot permit them, okay, please come to that room and see what we are doing. You cannot allow that. So the solution is only one thing: develop your own indigenous technologies, promote your own startups, have your own technologies over time till you are not depending on them anymore. That is all I have to say on this.
Thank you, Raj. Data is dollars, and data means a lot. That's why we must continue to follow what government has done. The next question is, Reddy sir, how much time you will give us, sir? We are nearing 19:30.
Another 5 to 6 minutes, then we can. Because
we have a lot of enthusiasm. There are so many questions that are there, interesting questions, like we are seeing the participants.
They are going to stay with us for another 5 to 6 minutes.
Yes, sir. There 530 odd people are still there with us. They are very keen to hear to the experts. Yes, sir. This is to Professor Arvind Kumar. Sir, the question is from Vyom. He is asking, China is building trans-border rivers and building bridges, regulators, and there are constructions that are coming up. Is it not going to adversely impact our water security, and what are we doing about it? Did you get the question, sir? Do I repeat, sir? Could you hear the question? Professor Arvind Kumar, did you hear the question, sir?
I heard your question.
Yes, sir.
I think water security remains a very important area right now. I think there was a report which came in the later part of 90s that if at all the World War III will happen, it will happen over water. China being a upper riparian state and holding Brahmaputra under their hold, that really speaks volume about China's intentions. Most of the things which China has been doing obviously is detrimental to India's water security or India's national security. But at the same time, India in the current context requires to really understand these many predicaments which are being posed by China in terms of promoting their interests and how best India can come up with certain very concrete strategy in handling this type of crisis. I think water security remains a larger target for India right now, especially in terms of understanding not only these challenges emanating from China, but also if you see what is happening with our Mahakali Treaty with Nepal. After the new map, what is going to happen, especially when Nepal has released the new map, the Mahakali Treaty with Nepal again is going to be questionable. Similarly, Padma Treaty with Bangladesh, Indus Water Treaty with Pakistan. Again, a lot of these already are in place. Even Indus Water Treaty, if you see, India really has been at the receiving end. India certainly has not been getting maximum benefit as Pakistan has been getting from Indus Water Treaty. And India has been supporting even during the adverse situation. India really has been showing the sign of seriousness in maintaining that treaty completely intact. So water security is going to be an area of greater irritant for India's national security in the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And the next question also is to you only, sir. And why is the electronic industry in India not able to cope up to the national security requirements?
I think that would really be completely unfair to say that it is not coping up with. It's question of how much we are able to harness. As I had told during my presentation that look, many of the things we have to do a very comprehensive assessment. Has India done the assessment in terms of what private sector can do for India? I think we are missing on the assessment and analysis part. We have the knowledge in bits and pieces. Electronics in India again is coming up in a big way. And one should know that now the focus has been on indigenization process. And most of these things again will get uplifted in the foreseeable future. But still India obviously requires a very concerted effort in enhancing its manufacturing capability. We are not good in manufacturing capability. I think that is why we are still banking on China and import. And then that import again has to be converted into larger export in the foreseeable future. If India has to become a respectable player in the world, India has to really become a net exporter of goods, not net importer of goods. So I think this is what I think India has to change. It will take its own course. But electronics, in my way, I think even if you take, I will give you one example, that a lot of these developments in electronics, especially in managing various aspects of electronics warfare, that again is coming up in a big way in India. But some of these information which may not be available in the public domain, which again remains some sort of a challenge for us to know much in detail. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. This question is to Raj. Raj, the question is Parvati, from Ankur. Despite being an IT superpower, why is India not able to prevent cyber attacks, and we are continuing to be the main target of cyber attacks? Have you heard it?
Well, it is not entirely true that India cannot prevent cyber attacks and that we are the target of cyber attacks. It's not entirely correct. As I said, first and foremost thing that one should understand is that no country in this world can prevent cyber attacks 100%. Okay, it is always a cat and a mouse game. There will be. So today, if a company is not hackable, you have to just wait. After 6 months, after 8 months, after 10 months, you will be able to hack that company. Okay, it's just a matter of time because the technology evolves. There are a lot of things that happen in a kind of company, systems, processes, people. You can always get inside and hack a company in various ways, right? For example, our great soldiers, unfortunately, thousands of them got trapped in social engineering from Pakistan, where a beautiful girl sent a social link, and then a lot of army guys, they clicked on it and they got trapped in that thing. Social engineering. So you will have these kind of attacks happening every now and then. So only education and awareness on cybersecurity can prevent those problems, right? So we cannot prevent cyber attacks. That's the first point that I want to make. Second point is that India is not failing to detect cyber attacks. It does have a great capacity to detect and stop also in a great way. And let me share this with you. When it comes to cybersecurity defensive measures and the processes, Indian companies are far ahead of Americans and in US companies when it comes to cybersecurity practices. I'm not saying this just because for sake of, I'm telling you a fact that the practices followed by Indian companies are far better and ahead. The technology that is used by the Indian banks is far superior to what Americans use in many ways. Of course, the problem here is that because the technology belongs to Americans, like your Microsoft, your Google, Facebook, the data is with them. So intelligence by nature, or Amazon, all friends and buddies. So but the cooperation is great, and intelligence sharing happens very easily with them. But that India is not good at it. So we have a great capacity to stop it. And only thing is that, as Mr. Arvind said, we need to harness the capacity within India in a more efficient manner. That's what needs to be done right now. So it will take some time, maybe a few more years, but it will happen.
Thank you. Thank you, Raj.
I want to add something with the chair's permission. I want to add something.
Yeah.
India's priority right now has been on protecting and securing critical infrastructure.
Yeah.
Power grid, banking and finance, railway network, and obviously nuclear command and control.
Yeah.
These four really are the target for the adversaries, and India has been protecting and securing. So I think India has been doing enough, but obviously, as rightly was pointed out, that India requires to again understand this predicament and obviously come to really certain solution to these many attacks. These attacks, as you know, that there is going to be a network-centric warfare.
Yes.
Already has started. There will not be any physical warfare. In that network-centric warfare, the attack will be over the networks. You just can imagine what will happen if suppose banking and finance gets penetrated by the terrorist group or any of the state institution. You just imagine what will happen when the railway, we have the largest network in the world. If the railway network gets completely hacked, what will happen? And likewise, power grid, which is I don't know, which is more critical to the other is very difficult to define. The criticality of all these four, which I said, critical infrastructure, is very difficult to define, which is more critical to the others. But right now, I think India has done fairly well in terms of protecting and securing these four critical infrastructures. Thank you.
I think you should also visit the NCIPC website, because the ones who have asked the question, because they have done tremendous amount of work. It comes under NTRO, and they have done phenomenal work with respect to protecting the India's CI infrastructure. You may imagine if you report a vulnerability, they respond in 24 hours time. You can imagine the amount of happiness you get when you see the government department responding so quickly, taking action on reports given to you, especially on cybersecurity. So yes, things have dramatically improved over the last few years, and they continue to improve. So yeah, things are happening, but it will take some time.
Okay, Raj. Thank you, Raj. And the last question for today, sir. This is to Professor Reddy, sir. Many of them participants are asking, what are the career opportunities if we do the courses on defense and security laws from NALSAR? And are there any scholarships available? Are there any provisions for paying the fees in installments? These are the questions that they are asking.
Okay, sir. So friends, thank you. Of course, this is we are offering this course on distance mode. What we call is on-site online. This is a 2-year, 4-semester course. Like I said, using technology, law, and management. Of course, we as a public institution, we don't say that you do this course, we will get jobs. But today, you all listen to eminent speakers. Private participation is going to happen in big way. So, and Ramesh and Professor Arvind also, do we have this kind of courses? I'm asking you, please let me know. I don't think any university which is offering particularly legal aspects of defense and security. So we are planning. Our motto is to take aerospace defense education to the doorsteps of the needy. This is our slogan, with affordable cost. And being in NALSAR standards, this course is like 40,000 per annum. It is almost coming, like 80,000. We also give again concession to the defense people because we have a special affinity to, my defense friends. So offers when it comes, yes, there are great, challenges and also opportunities. Reason is that private sector is coming up. Definitely another 5 years, if you look at last 2-3 months statements, the defense industry, space industry, if you look at big investments, million or even I can say $1 billion business is going to be invested in the private sector. Lot of companies are coming. So they need skill power. They need manpower, not only, like general, but skill, semi-skill, super skill. So I think these courses will help in that. Today, industry is looking multi-skill talent. So where, NALSA courses will help. Regarding the fellowship, this is a distance. We don't give any fellowship, but you can, pay installment. That is a yearly, for this. That case to
Very much.
I can't make as a, general statement, but depend on the case to case I can.
Thank you very much, sir. And I take this opportunity to thank the VC, NALSA University, Professor Reddy, who has been really pushing this lecture series. The technical team and the research assistants, they have done extremely good job of supporting this whole activity, coordinating. A lot of midnight oil being burnt by them. We thank all of them, sir. And more importantly, the participants. Even now, 500 people being online. It's amazing, fantastic enthusiasm shown by them. We thank one and all there. And Professor Arvind Kumar and Dr. Ramesh Kumar and Rajshekhar, all three of you have been extraordinary speakers. You have conveyed a lot of good points, very valid points, in a very, very easily, lucidly understandable manner. Thank you so much once again. Thank you, sir. Thank you for the panelists.
Okay,
Thank you.
Sir, before closing, I want to thank the moderator who has done excellent work. So thank you, Naidu sir, for conducting this webinar. So last one, we have an announcement. Next webinar is on 12th of this month, that is Sunday, 3:30 to 5. We are going to have a webinar on COVID impacts on aviation industry in Indian aviation industry. So I request everyone to please make note of this thing. We have a shortage of time. That's why I'm making announcement. So we'll get back to you with the full information. Thank you, sir. We can close now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we meet on 12th with the aviation special.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Tariq.
Thank you, Lakshmi, Tariq, and sir,
Thank you.
everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next webinar will be live in another 5 to 10 minutes. The people who want to register can start their registration.
Okay, good.
Great news. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
People who want to know more about the courses, they can visit our website, cadel.nalsa.ac.in or nalsapro.org. These are the two websites which have all the information regarding the courses. You can call us and fill up the form. We'll follow up with you. Thank you.